Black lights and booze burn when I record for Watts. And every black like Troy Davis who never had a fair shot. All black.
Welcome to Left of Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal. We're joined today by Monica A. Coleman, who's professor of constructive theology and African American religions at Claremont School of Theology. She's also an ordained elder in the African Methodist Episcopal Church, the AME, and the author of several books, including Making a Way Out of No Way, A Womanist Theology, Not Alone, Reflections on Faith and Depression, and she is here joining us at Left of Black for the publication of her new memoir, Bipolar Faith, A Black Woman's Journey with Depression and Faith. How are you doing today, Monica?
It's great to be here.
Thanks for joining us. You know, when you share very, very personal stories, it's one thing to journal these things.
Right.
It's a totally other thing to decide to share this with the world. What made you come to this point where you wanted to write so personally about your life, obviously, but also so publicly?
Before I got a PhD, I was a writer. I was a freelance writer and kind of in the genre of nonfiction essayist, but still more political writing with some personal writing involved. But you go to these workshops where they always say, you know, if you died tomorrow, what's the thing you hadn't done? Yeah. And people always say, I wish I'd have worked less, or I wish I spent more time with my family or something. And for me, it was write this book.
To tell your story.
This was the story. And so I was like, wow, that's saying something. I need to do this. And I think I also wanted so much to fill the void in the literature that when I was looking for stories, I couldn't find anything like my story. There weren't many Black people writing at all about mental health challenges. The stories of mental health challenges, none of them were written by people of faith. Right. People weren't writing about bipolar II. And those things alone were, you know, I wanted to kind of give that story to the world while also reminding it's still a Black girl story. Yeah. And still has this kind of coming of age part to it.
You know, the book, you know, really pivots on 2 points. One, the reality of mental health, but also rape. Yeah. And, you know, you found a way to talk about the way that the Black church sometimes turns a deaf ear to both. Yeah. And in your case, literally in the same, almost at the same time. Yeah. Talk about what it was like being very open and honest about this particular shortcoming in terms of thinking about the Black church, thinking about faith in general.
Yeah. Well, I think I could do it in part because it's a critique from within, right? I mean, it's my church, right? The church in which I grew up, the church in which I'm clergy. So in some ways it's easier because it's a family critique, right? In some ways. These are the areas in which we fall short, not they fall short. Things we don't know how to talk about. And because I'm clergy, I know that most people don't have bad hearts. People don't have bad intentions. We just don't know what to say. We don't know what to do. There are things that individuals haven't thought about. I mean, clearly there are people who aren't nice and aren't cool and can be predatory. But the majority of people just have their hearts in the right place and either just never thought about it or don't know what to say or do. And so I wanted to approach it by saying, this is what it's like. This is what it feels like. These are my stories, but I've become the bearer of so many other people's stories that I know it's not just my experience. And how do we then create programs and create ministries and share and talk about how do we respond? How do we offer solace and safety and faith to people who are wrestling with trauma and wrestling with pain and suffering?
When you write about being at the Metropolitan Church and the minister says to you to think bigger. Yeah. And you come up with the Diner Project. Talk about what it was to come to this revelation about the need to really have these programs and willing to take that on, even as you're still in some ways struggling with these realities yourself.
Well, I'd probably say it's naivete. I didn't know what I was doing, but it was the only thing I could do. That was the only thing that was happening in my life, was being a survivor of sexual violence and trying to figure out how to cobble my life back together. So if I was going to do ministry, it had to be that, because that was all I could think about and all I could focus on. And because I'm kind of nerdy, right? I research my way through my problems. and
some of this in the era before the internet.
Oh, right. Before you weren't Googling things, right? I mean, there was email,
right.
kind of,
but no WebMD.
Right, none of that, right? So I'm in the stacks, reading these works written by mostly second wave feminists, right, about rape culture and. Trying to say, okay, well, what, and working with crisis centers and looking at these two voids that were there, really, that a lot of people, even in Nashville, the buckle of the Bible Belt, that the people in the helping professions didn't know how to talk about religion. And people in churches didn't know how to talk about sexual violence. And that being clergy, even as young female clergy and all the discrimination that came with that, still by being clergy and saying it gave more authority and give me more access than to both clergy and to helping professions than I otherwise would have had to say, okay, because it was me, I was like, what would I have needed? What would I have wanted? Yeah. What would the dream church have done? And then try to do that.
Well, I mean, when you look at black communities, right, I mean, you really touch on two issues that are very much taboo. No one wants to really talk about sexual violence and rape as it occurs within our communities.
Right.
We still, I don't think, have a language to talk about mental health, let alone specificity around it, around things like bipolar and things of that nature. I was struck in the book reading about your parents' response when you decided to go to the police to report the rape, and while they clearly cared for you, part of their concern was like, well, this is going to get out.
Right.
What was it like trying, on the one hand, to try to push the church to think differently about these issues, but also confronting very real taboo issues for many black Americans around these very issues?
Yeah, in some ways it was tough, right? But it was necessary. I guess I felt that it needed to be done, and I didn't want to do it. I mean, God and I would have these conversations, like, I don't want to do this, and God's like, but this call keeps coming, and I would kind of go back and forth and say, but why do I have to do it? Why me? Why not someone else? And God said, because you can. My mother would say, you've never cared what people thought about you, which drove her crazy when I was like 12 and 13. But I guess because I didn't care enough what people thought about me, it worked. And so I was able to say, like, we have to talk about these things. And I don't think, well, it's my story, right? And some of my family's story. It's also part of what it means to be African American, right? I mean, part of these are the heritage of slavery, right? And the heritage of our pains and our responses to war and poverty and sharecropping. And I wanted to say, like, these are actually, we're not supposed to be okay, right? That of course we're not all right. And just because we don't talk about it doesn't mean it doesn't happen and that we don't live with the legacy of it.
You're watching Left of Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal. We're joined today by Monica Coleman, the author of the new book, Bipolar Faith, A Black Woman's Journey with Depression and Faith, a brand new memoir. Some of the things that were very striking about the book is how honestly you talked about trying to navigate all of this as a child, and not having a name for what you were feeling, not thinking that that there are folks around you who fully understand, family or otherwise, and also these tensions that are in the home. Around your parents. How difficult was it to go back to think about your childhood and try to come up with what now is for you very comfortable theoretical language, to describe what you were experiencing as a child and particularly as a black girl?
It was hard. I was an avid journaler, right? From the age of probably 9 on. So I had these journals. And going back and looking at my journals in some ways was very hard because I could see how hard it was for me and how painful it was. And how much I didn't understand what was happening around me and didn't have a language for it, even though I can now look back and name things. So that part was hard. And because I had this kind of dual memory, like the things that were very good as well as the things that were very difficult. Writing about it was really illuminating though, because looking at it as an adult, it helped me to see that there were no villains, in my childhood mind and sometimes my adult mind, like I'm the good guy and they're bad guys. And I could see, no, that's not the case. There were people striving and trying to do their best with what they had. And sometimes they didn't have much. Sometimes they were doing better than what they inherited, but it still wasn't enough.
Yeah.
But that there generally weren't malintents, that things were much more complex than I initially thought they were. And so even when people were abusive or there was pain, I also could kind of step back and see, well, how are they managing what they've inherited?
Yeah.
And so in that sense, it really helped me, you know, to reconcile and have a greater peace about things than I otherwise would have.
You know, there's part of a narrative in our communities that suggests that if you're high achieving, that if you succeed academically, then all this other stuff goes away, right? And you're clearly high achieving, right? You're going to Harvard. I got a kick, you know, as you relate to, you just did it for the sake of doing it, right? You didn't know where Cambridge was, right? So folks show you it's Harvard, it's like, well, let me see what this is gonna be.
Right.
But I also love when you get to Harvard and you start taking these courses in African American studies. Skip has just gotten there.
Right.
And the conversation that you have with your parents, right? Where they're like, you know, we didn't send you to Harvard to learn slave narratives and black arts poetry. Put that in some sort of context for the audience to talk about what it means to be at some place like Harvard and with all the things that you could choose to embrace, African American studies. You know, for any of us who teach any form of African American studies, right? We know this is an ongoing challenge. But what was it like for you as a teenager navigating this with your parents and friends and other folks?
Well, you know, my parents were Black history people, right? I mean, I'm reading Paul Laurence Dunbar at an early age and, you know, memorizing these things for forensic contests. And, you know, I had books by Benjamin Quarles as a teenager and I read Henry Louis Gates for fun, you know, in high school. So it wasn't like I had no exposure to Black studies. I just didn't know it was called Black studies. It was like my parents supplementing my education with cultural material and making sure, you know, I knew about my history and literature. So I didn't know you could major in that though, right? And like many others, my parents were my father's first generation, college, my mother's second generation, and you go to school to get a job. And so
to learn a skill.
And they're like, you could have studied Black people right here in Michigan. Like, you didn't have to go to Harvard to learn about Black people. And they kept saying, well, maybe you can joint major with economics. Like, maybe we can still keep you on track for this like corporate plan where you get a job. And I felt like, much to their chagrin, but I'm the one who has to go to class. And I'm the one who has to like it. And if I don't like it, it's not going to go well. And so on one level, there was this revelation that I could study what I liked, which no one told me you could do. I mean, not that I didn't like other topics, but that I could actually study the thing I had been reading about in my spare time and that I was passionate about. Like, that was what was amazing to me about African American studies. But they kept saying, what are you going to do with this? Like, are you going to get a job? And they didn't know, I didn't know, we didn't come from elite education. And actually, no one asks you what you major in when you go to Harvard, for the most part. And so I was like, I'm going to teach. I don't know if I thought I would, but it sounded really good to say that. And I kept getting these fellowships so I could show them that like people will fund. I would apply for fellowships to do research. Like, I'm not going to cost you money. I was trying to show them that like there were people who supported this idea. That I can have interesting ideas maybe and write about them. So I think there were times when I was working that my father still thought I was in school. When I had a job, he's like, you're still in school? No, I'm done. Because you're still kind of in school, just, no, I teach, I have a salary. It's still like idea of being an academic is it's still a foreign idea in many ways.
Yet this work in Black Studies at Harvard, you know, leads you to the Race Matters conference, and you're sitting at a cafe one day, next to Angela Davis, and you know, Angela Davis actually has this way of like showing up at conferences and just like being there.
Yes.
But you strike a conversation with her, and she literally tells you, you need to talk to Renita Weems. Talk about that moment.
Oh, I was starstruck, I mean, she sits down, it's this tiny cafe, the table's right there, and I'm trying to think to myself, I don't sound like a groupie, say something smart.
Because I was just reading you in this book, right? And now you're sitting here next to me.
Right, so I'm like, well, what do you say
Yeah.
to someone? And so of course what I said was, I like your hair. And she says, I like your hair too. And that's how the conversation begins. And she says, you need to meet Renita Weems. Of course, I have no idea who Renita Weems is.
Right.
So again, trying to sound smart, I say, I'm not yet familiar with her work. And of course, I became familiar with her work as soon as I left the conference. And she, Angela Davis arranged for me to go to this conference, which was the 10th anniversary of the National Black Women's Health Project conference, where she and Renita Weems are both speaking, which was a life-changing conference. It's in Atlanta. There are all these black women academics looking like black women academics, right? Wearing mudcloth coats and with natural hair and purple and, all the images we have. It was like the Black Women in the Academy conference, but a little more grassroots and not cold, right? And, and I was just amazed. And one of Angela Davis's mentees were there, and we were there getting red clay on our shoes. Like, we'd read about red clay, but we'd never seen red clay, because we've been reading these Southern women writers, but like, oh my gosh, we have red clay on our shoes. And it was, it was just nerd heaven. And I meet Renita Weems, and before I meet her, she's talking. And as she's talking, at the same time, I've been wrestling with this call to preach and wrestling with what it would mean to be a minister. And I had never seen women clergy, had never seen young people clergy until I went to college. So I'm beginning to know that this is a possibility. Yeah. And she's talking, and I'm beginning to I can do this. I think it'll be okay. It won't be bad. This is something I can do. So by the time I get to her, standing in line, I have my books to get signed, I'm just crying, and I'm just this little heaping mess of tears. And Angela Davis comes up and says, this was the young woman I was telling you about. And Renita Weems looks at me like, her? No, it's just like, I have a story to tell. I'm going to be a preacher. And she's like, well, good for you. Now sit here and collect yourself, baby. And began this wonderful mentoring relationship.
How do you feel now that you're on the other side of that there in fact are young women who look towards you for guidance in that way?
In some ways, it's hard to believe, right? Because I don't remember that I've grown up and aged, and I think I'm still 20 years younger. But I also learned so much from them, and I do what many of my mentors did, like some of their smaller practices about how I address students, or, some of my best teachers and mentors, they just kicked my ass. I mean, they were hard faculty, and they demanded a lot of me. And people say that's what I do, that's what my students do. But they also cared about me as a person and my life and my vocation. And I do try to do that as well. I try to see my students as not just walking brains, right, but as whole people, and addressing where the other issues that are going on in their lives as well.
I won't say that we're in a unique political moment. I won't say that we're in an unprecedented political moment. We are in a very different political moment. How are you processing that moment, this moment, given the kind of work that you do?
Well, I think it's more and more needed. And in some ways, it's easier to talk about, right? Because of the kinds of violence and the levels of death and the kind of traumas that we're experiencing, and social media helps a lot. People are more willing to talk about activist stress, right? About depression, about being burnt out, about being sad, and it gives openings for this larger conversation. So in many ways, because we're able to see in more and more ways more grassroots activism, not that didn't exist before, right, but we're able to kind of have access to it through social media and the proliferation of media. Because we're seeing just these great pains around losing Black lives, Black women's lives, Black men's lives, Black trans lives, we're able to acknowledge that grief more. And so in that sense, it's easier to have these conversations and to talk about violence and about gender and about mental health challenges, because they're not seeming like that clinical thing that happens to other people, but rather this condition that we're all wrestling with.
There are a couple of moments in the book I really liked where music comes into play. I had forgotten about Jeanne, for instance. I'm running through my Google playlist to try to find.
Oh, I have a playlist on my website.
Oh, that's even
you
better.
You get all the songs. All the songs from the book are on my website, bipolarfaith.com. You can listen to them. Spotify.
Sweet Honey in the Rock.
Yeah.
You know, how central has music been? I know you played piano when you were young. Are you still playing piano?
I do a little bit. I need to brush up on it.
Right. I mean, because you talk about, you know, trying to find that middle space,
Right.
you know, when you were young, between, you know, not knowing what bipolar is and trying to find that balance, right?
Right.
You know, the piano for you was this kind of middle space.
Right, very much so. Yeah, you know, I never thought that music was as important to me until therapists would say, like, you know, music is important to you. And I'm like, you think? And I realized, yeah, there was this kind of soundtrack to my life. I mean, these happy moments of being with your teenage girlfriends, and you're driving to the movies and you're playing in Vogue, right? To the ways in which certain musicians in certain groups just shaped my faith, you know, gave voice to what I was thinking about and wondering about spiritually, politically, you know, the ways in which spirituals that I grew up on were formative, as well as, you know, pop and hip hop and Sweet Honey. And so I wanted to feel that way, and I wanted to also, hopefully, readers to notice when the music goes away and when things are silent. And when it comes back, how the music is different.
You travel a lot, talk to a lot of audiences. What has the response been both to this book, but generally when you have conversations about depression and rape?
It's been really amazing. It's just the most amazing work I've ever done. And I'm just humbled that people read the book, that they like it. All the things I was worried about, no one talks about. Right? The scenes.
Well, what are the things what kind of things were you worried about?
Oh, the scenes I was the most concerned about, the places where I think I'm the most vulnerable. I mean, there's a sex scene, right? And I'm a minister. And so I wanted to show that, like, you know, people have sex, because we don't talk about that, right?
Right.
And, you know, but I wrote and rewrote and edited that scene, you know, or, you know, places where I talk about, you know, relationships or family, like parts that were hard for me to write, no one talks about. Wow. So it just goes to show I was worried about all the wrong things. But no one says, like, oh my gosh, your story, like, they don't kind of pry into my personal business, as I thought people might, but really they tell me how they respond to it, like how something I've written brings up something they've been thinking about, or something they've been wrestling about, or their experiences, and they didn't have a voice for it, they didn't know other people experienced it. It begins to, you know, raise a conversation, and that's exciting to me. That's thrilling. I've gotten to talk to pretty large churches. And to see that large churches are having conversations about mental health and faith, that brings so much hope, right? And that it's so much less taboo to talk about being a survivor of sexual violence than it used to be. That brings great hope as well. And that there's still work to be done, of course, but that there are places and there are congregations and there are universities that are willing to start talking about this. And to me, just being open, talking about things, being honest about the experiences that we have, that's the huge and big first step to disarming the power that keeps us silent.
What about your family?
Yeah, well. It depends on who you are in my family, right? Some parts of my family, you know, there's a part of my family where these stories are known.
Right.
We just didn't talk about them.
Right.
And so they've been like, yeah, you know, or we like it. And they came out to book signings and bought the book and read the book and said we liked it, right? I mean, in some ways, no surprise. Or I know you as my cousin, but not as a full human being in a way. Like we know you, the holiday you, right? And so it's kind of getting to know each other in better ways and in more personal ways. Like, yeah, me too. In some aspects of it. Some of my family who appear in the book. Here's a pleasant moment, then I'll share the harder moments. My cousin Teresa, who's in the book, you know, I write about saying how much I wanted a big sister. And I wanted to be around someone who was cool and who smelled like Estee Lauder's Beautiful and who I could look up to. And she says, that's who you were to me. And I was like, wow. that really blew me away. And in some ways it was hard for her to read, because she said, I remember these times and they were hard and they were painful.
Right.
But it was neat to see that, you know, she saw me the way I was looking for someone to look up to. And that really moved me. And we never talked about that. I mean, who talks about that?
Right.
And then there were some family members who didn't like it. And they didn't like, they said, well, this is not, you're telling things that aren't nice. They didn't say they weren't true.
Right.
They just said they weren't nice. And I'm like, well, you know, Anne Lamont has this wonderful quote about, if you wanted me to write better things, you should have been better to me, right? And I'm like, and I held back a lot, right? I'm thinking of all the things I didn't write. And I wasn't trying to be gratuitous either way, but, you know, to serve the narrative. And they've been upset about that. And I'm like, well, okay. I mean, it's something I would have said before, or something I would have said afterwards. My father has now passed, so I wouldn't know his response to the book. And outside of the, people often ask, like, what happened to our relationship? And we had a good relationship before he passed away. A lot of kind of reconciliation had occurred. Who's to say what people would have thought about it? But in as much as I believe in the ancestors, and I do, you know, we're good. And so, otherwise, you know, my mom, I was worried about her reading it because I thought it would make her sad. Because as a parent, I understand that you don't want your children to hurt. And I thought it would make her sad to know that I was hurting. But actually, no, she was just, you know, what's that boy's name again? And where do we find him? Like, you know, she was back with her righteous anger.
There's that telling moment early in the book, you know, where you're talking to your mom and the realization that both of you had escape plans. You know, which for me was just like a really amazing moment in the book. That and it bears out, you know, what you just said about your mom, that she probably knew. On some, you know, on some level, what you were processing, because she was experiencing some of it herself. You mentioned in the book that this is a great line where you talk about all of this has been the process of integrating the trauma of rape into your life, right? So it's something that is more controllable. I don't want to say seamless, but it's a part of who you are. But when you tell the narratives about your grandparents, about alcoholism, about your dad, I mean, it seems as though you've built a model on how more broadly we can talk about trauma and find a way, you know, writ large for Black folks, you know, how to be able to integrate this trauma into our lives and find a way to go forward. Was that something that you considered as you were telling this story, that it would have larger implications beyond simply, well, not simply, but beyond talking about mental health?
Yeah, that was a hope. You know, in the mental health world, right? If you look at magazines or journals about mental health, it's a chemical imbalance, it's a brain disease. We take medication to try to rebalance the chemical imbalance. And I want to say it is so much more complicated than that. And to tell this African American story, right? That it's about trauma and sharecropping and war and alcoholism.
When the one minister goes to you who had dealt with childhood sexual assault, and you're thinking, you know, you've been talking to all these male ministers, you're talking to a woman now, right? She'll hit it, and she describes the person as demons. And
that I can cast out.
That you can, you're like, no.
I mean, no, these are not cast outable in the name of, like, don't you think I would have cast them out in the name of Jesus if I could have? And I just wanted to show that it's so much more complicated. And that it's not unusual, right? That so many of us have these stories in our families.
Because we feel shame about it. I mean, that's a reality of it, right? And it's like as if somehow this shame is unique to us as a people on the one hand, but also individually, it's something unique.
Because we haven't talked about it. We have that never let them see you sweat kind of thing. Don't air your dirty laundry, right? I mean, which are strategic principles for racial justice and unification, but don't serve us well. And so to be able to voice them, and I tried to describe them not with anger, but with, like, this is just kind of what happened and how it was, and what else would someone do, given these kind of experiences.
What's next for you?
Yeah, it's a good question. I've got an academic book I'm slowly working on around religious pluralism and multiple religious belonging. And my publicist keeps wanting me to write a lifestyle book. Like, it's called the Bipolar Faith too, right? Which, I might about, parenting and, like what does my social media profile look like, parenting and vegan dieting.
Right.
But I have thought, there aren't much about, kind of parenting when you have a mental health challenge.
Right.
And all the stresses that come with that, the things you're worried about, how not nearly as bad as I thought it was going to be.
Yeah.
Although young children are the antithesis of good mental health, right?
Right.
Lack of sleep, lack
Right.
of consistent lifestyle, right? Being very needy, right?
Yes,
Right. So I might, and I love being a mom. Love being a mom.
That's good.
And so I might write something about that.
We've been joined by Reverend Monica A. Coleman, who is the author of Bipolar Faith, a Black woman's journey with depression and faith. Thank you for joining us on Left to Black.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a real honor.
Black lights and booze burn when I record for Watts. And every black like Troy Davis who never had a fair shot. All black everything black, culture over everything, y'all. We taking it back.